Let me just start by adding something to what Mariana said. Yeah, I've been around COMEXI, it seems forever. It's only 17 years. I remember when Andres Rosenthal decided that Mexico needed COMEXI. And I remember when Luis Rubio decided Mexico still needs COMEXI. And far more importantly, when they had the wisdom to hire Mariana as the CEO. Every country needs in its institutional landscape, in the institutional framework, organizations like this one. And one of the problems, I think, as a friend of Mexico, is that there aren't more COMEXI. So there aren't more organizations that are actually thinking outside the framework of government, outside the framework of the private sector, about the issues that are driving your future. So thank you for doing what you're doing. Mariana already listed some of the issues I'm going to talk about, but I think she understated the case somewhat. If there was a subtitle or even a title to this talk, it would be "The End of the World as You Know It," because I really do think we are sitting at a point where the post-war period, sort of from 1950 to call it 2010, something like that, 60, 65 years, those were the best 65 years literally in the history of civilization. More people emerged from poverty, fewer people died from war. In almost every country, the health, nutrition, the literacy of the global of all the populations increased. That's the good news. The bad news is it's over. And what we're challenged with now, I'm going to talk about why I think it's over. And then collectively we can talk a bit about what do we want in the future. But the point of departure, and Xi Jinping is more or less saying the same. You can't read it there, he's in the way. Xi Jinping is more or less saying the same thing. We are at a time of such profound change. There's all sorts of reasons for it. Partly, of course, it's the Chinese. Think about why the Chinese don't like the current system. Very simple answer. They weren't there at the creation of this system. In the 40s, Taiwan did have a seat. Roosevelt's vision for the world included China as one of the great powers, but then they had a civil war. It ends up in Taiwan, and China's outside the system up until after Dr. Kissinger and others began re-engineering the entry. So China, as a great power today, has no connection, no commitment, and actually, frankly, not much interest in the system as it now exists. They want a different system. Us, the United States. We love this system. It's ours. We have enormous benefits from this system. But we are, and I'll talk a bit more about this, in my judgment, we are no longer interested or perhaps capable of sustaining the kind of global system that we sustained from more or less 1948 on. And it's not Donald Trump, although he's a problem, and it wasn't Barack Obama, although I also think he was a problem in that regard. There is a systematic shifting away from an American, both political and even beyond that, interest in the system that we have known all these years. Oops, you said it was easy to use these things. There we go. So what's driving this change? There's a lot of things. You can read as well as I can read it. But if you think about what we want from governments, it's a very simple social contract. We give them our votes. From them we want only two things. We want prosperity and we want peace. Now we're sort of doing okay on the peace side in most cases, but in prosperity we are failing everywhere. We're failing in the United States, we're failing in Mexico, we're failing in Brazil, we're failing throughout Europe. Why Brexit? Because they failed to produce growth. And there's a lot of reaction to that. So you start with that we've squeezed the middle classes everywhere. In the United States case, it's 30 years without any improvement in the quality of the middle class. One number. The Federal Reserve does a poll, and they ask the question, if you, at a family level, you need $400 for an emergency. Emergency could be your kid just got run over. The emergency could be that you're going to be evicted. $400. 40%, 45% actually, of Americans say, I couldn't handle it. I could not handle it. Half of those 45 say, I could borrow against my credit card and pay it back over 6 months. $400. The other half say, I'd have to sell something. And they're not talking stocks and bonds, they're talking cars and TVs. And a chunk of those say, couldn't handle it. Couldn't get that health care for my kid that I need. Couldn't avoid being evicted. That tells you something about what's going on. It tells you why Donald Trump is president, among other things. So we've had in country after country after country, the social contract isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's not producing growth. It's producing growth for all of us. It's producing growth for me. I've had a blast the last 10 years. But it's not producing it for the bulk of most countries in most places. One of the consequences of that, besides Donald Trump, is that promotes populism, it promotes nationalism, it promotes this idea that the good old days were much better. So how do you get back to the good old days? And that obviously sounds like a candidate you can all think of. It sounds like a candidate I can think of in my country. It sounds like Brexit. It sounds like the French Yellow Jackets. It sounds like, again, country after country. I'm scared of the future, and you should be scared of the future. Let's do what we used to do and do that again. And wasn't it great? Now, it wasn't so great, but it seems greater than where we're headed. And I will talk, and it's an important point, the accelerating tech and climate change. Part of why the world in about 5 years, 10 years for sure, 15 years guaranteed, will be fundamentally different is the pace of disruptive technology is now accelerating. The pace of climate change has gone from something in the future. Remember they used to talk about 2100. No one in this room cares about 2100 because we're not going to be here. Now it is today. We're getting the impacts of climate change today. One of the big drivers in mass migration, turns out, is climate change. There's a trick to this that I have not mastered. There we go. One of the problems, and this is the consequence of economic stagnation, income inequality. The numbers, I'll go to some countries in a minute, this is the last 40 years. This is where all of the wealth in the world for 40 years has gone. The piece in the middle is the European, American, and Japanese middle classes. The piece on the left is partly Mexico, but overwhelmingly China and India. And the piece on the right are the 1% globally. Most a quarter, more than a quarter, of every penny that was created for 40 years has gone to the 1% globally. And it is a global issue. These are the most concentrated countries, at least as the OECD counts things. Yes, we have a 1% issue in the United States. You have it in Mexico. You have it in China. You have it in India. Even Sweden. Sweden, we all have this image besides blondes. It's a socialist paradise. Increasingly, Sweden's economic data are unequal. It's happening everywhere. And that raises this question again. Yep, you have all this growth in the world, but I'm not getting any of it. The system isn't paying out for me. One of the consequences of that is, do you trust your institutions? Now, I am stunned, Frank. This is data that was done. Edelman does an annual survey. They look at 35 countries around the world, tens and tens of thousands of interviews. They ask a lot of questions. One of the questions they ask is this one: do you trust your institutions? Now, I'm surprised. The only surprise in all of this chart is Mexico. This was late last year, so it's after the election, but before the inauguration. But surprisingly, Mexicans told them, we trust our institutions. And that's terrific. And so maybe some of all this notion, all the story I heard today from many of my friends, Mexican institutions are shot, they're being destroyed. Maybe, but maybe we're exaggerating. The point I want to make here is not the left hand. I want to make 2 points about this. On the right-hand side first, that's all of the industrial countries. We have an enormous trust problem in industrial countries. We don't trust institutions, we don't trust presidents, we don't trust Congresses, we don't trust religious leaders, we don't trust CEOs, we don't trust anybody. That's a problem. It's a problem for governance. It's a problem for trying to work together to build a future. Look at the countries on the left other than Mexico. Tends to be the Asians. Now, question. None of us in this room think that democracy in the United States or Germany or France works anything like the system, they call it a democracy, in China or Indonesia, the UAE, Malaysia. There's systemic difference. The democracies tend to be in the no-trust countries. The less than democracies tend to be in the trust countries. If you're thinking about the future of liberal democracy, that's a problem. This is a bigger problem. You can't build a country if you're not optimistic about the future. It does not work. That's been the Brazilian genius forever. It's not anymore. Again, get to Mexico in a minute, but look at those numbers. People are terrified of the future in the industrial world. They're probably right. They expect 5 years from now to be worse. Systematically, every country I know says, my kids will not have it as well as I have it. That you've had this big peak, and now it's either going to flatline or begin to fall. Now again, if you want to be optimistic about your country, we get different answers in Mexico. We get people who, maybe they know what they're talking about or not, are more optimistic about the future. That's something you can build on, but it's something that in terms of the future of the system, so the United States, 52% of people are scared of their future. Are they going to elect a president, put aside whatever we all think about Donald Trump, are they going to elect a president who thinks what he really needs to do is invest much more in global enterprise, or are they looking for a president that's going to save their future domestically? I think it's easy. Part of the problem, why do we care about income inequality? I like income inequality. I have a benefit from being unequal incomes. But it's driving politics all in the wrong direction. It is driving in country after country parties that tend to be more autocratic, tend to be strong leader kinds of countries. In all of those countries you ask, do you want a strong leader? And the answer is yes, we need a strong leader. Every democracy I know, we want a strong leader, which is incompatible with our notion of what is democracy. And this has been going on for a while, but it's beginning to accelerate. It's certainly accelerating throughout Europe. Since I was a kid, I remember when I was very young, growing up in the suburb of Chicago in a Catholic school, we used to have drills for nuclear war. I don't know if you did this in Mexico, but the nuns would have us get under our desks for the nuclear, the nuclear war drill. Now, we were kids. It was Catholic school. You couldn't ask questions. No one ever asked, how am I going to survive a nuclear war under my desk that I'm not going to survive standing up? But other than the Cuban Missile Crisis, and perhaps one other time in the 80s when the Russians actually came very close to launching, we haven't really thought about geopolitics for a long time. Cold War's gone, the West won, the Russians are still there, but who cares? We've lived in a world where the issues of the great issues of war and peace, the issues of geopolitics, were for historians. They weren't affecting our lives. That's over, and it's over for some of the reasons I've already suggested. This happens to be some work that some journalists do. One of my favorite investment banks has exactly the same chart for their clients, because if you're thinking about how the world works and suddenly you've got to think again about the potential for war, the potential for confrontation. An example. At Davos this year, one of the things the Davos guys get right is that every year they have, before the meeting starts, they do a global survey, about 15,000 people, of the elite around the world. What worries you? What scares you? What petrifies you? This year, the top 5 answers, the first 3 were geopolitical confrontation, either economic, political, or technological. And the next 2 were technological risks, either to my identity or to my firm's or my country's infrastructure. Geopolitics is back. We're worried about it again. It's partly back. You can almost argue this was, whether it's good or not is a different issue. You can almost argue that it was inevitable. With the rise of China, with the disappearance of Europe as anything relevant in power terms, you had to have the U.S. and China sooner or later begin to confront each other and try to work it out. There was this myth a while ago that the Chinese would be just like us. They were going to be liberal. Whenever we hear the word reform, it always means democracy. It's never meant democracy to the Chinese or Russian or Saudi or etc. leadership. It means something else. It means economic liberalization. It means economic reform. But it never means political reform. So it was inevitable that the U.S. and China would have to figure out how we're going to run the world. In 2013, there was, when President Obama's in office, Xi's been there only for a moment in China. The Chinese asked the Americans for a summit. Now, usually when you do summits, at least in the good old days, you did them in the capital. Pomp and circumstance, dinners, well-staffed out meetings, lots of photography. The Chinese said, no, we want a shirt sleeve summit, their term. We want some place in the country where we can sit and talk for 2 days and seriously about the future. So they ended up in Southern California at this very luxurious resort. And the Chinese put on the table a new concept. They said, we're the rising power, you're the legacy power. We're not implying that you're going to go away anytime soon, but this is a fact. We're obviously the rising power, and it's been your system for a long time. They said, historically, every time that's happened, it ends in conflict. And when the Chinese say to you historically, they don't mean 50 years or 100 years, they mean 5,000 years. And they trotted out how many times, I mean, way beyond Sparta and Athens, but it's almost always the case that there's conflict. And they said, look, we're, both of us, too smart. We've learned too much. We have too much at stake. Why would we want conflict? So we proposed, they said, what they called a new great power relationship. And that new great power relationship, more or less, was let's divide the world between us. Let's say the past is the past, and we just start over, and we figure out spheres of influence. You have yours, we have ours. We'll figure out how to work together collectively. And, well, people are still trying to understand what they have in mind. Next question was, well, give us an example of what this means in practice. And they said, glad you asked. Korea. This is back to 2013. It's relevant to what happened or didn't happen today. They say in 2013, terrific, we will denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. Now that's Greek for take care of North Korea, because we have no nukes in the South and haven't had them there for a long time. So this was a declaration, we'll solve it. Interesting. What do you want? And they said, you have an alliance, a treaty alliance with Japan. We think that is an artifact of a different world. We think its time has come and gone. We think you should end that alliance. They said, we're not going to invade Japan. We're not going to attack Japan, but it's our sphere of influence, and you should not have a treaty alliance to go to war, because who's going to attack the Japanese? Only the Chinese. So this alliance is directed at us. Get rid of it. Needless to say, President Obama and Secretary Kerry said, no, won't do that. But you fast forward to the nuclear crisis with the North Koreans. Question, is it even imaginable that, because in 2013 they had some very crude research programs, they had some very crude missiles, and all of a sudden in 2017 and 18 they are shooting these missiles that have their interballistic capabilities. How'd they get all that? Is it even remotely possible that anything goes into North Korea that the Chinese don't know about? And the engines on their new missiles happen to be Russian engines, or Russian make engines. Is there any possibility that was unknown to the Chinese? Of course it wasn't. This is about the confrontation. So as you think about what this might look like, this is one attempt at just a schematic. As a good American, I would prefer the U.S. dominant side of this, and I'd prefer the collaboration side of this. I suspect the Chinese might prefer the collaboration side, but certainly the China dominant. Any of those boxes are a new place. In the lower left-hand corner, that really means the Chinese, by definition, can dominate the continent of Asia. They are a great land power already. They don't particularly have much sea power. Their air is still relatively simple. And we can dominate the islands, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. That's a possible world. Another possible lower right-hand side is the Cold War, just like the good old Cold War, with one major difference. There are no ideological differences between the Americans and the Chinese. The Soviet Union, the U.S. was always ideology at its root. This is all about power. It's all about, but there's no ideology anywhere in it. Does that make a Cold War more risky? Because it turned out the Cold War never got hot. It got hot in third countries, Vietnam, Algeria, places, but it never got hot. It's a question. In the upper corner, you have India. India is not a country that projects power in its history. It's not a country that at the moment has the capacity to project power. They're way behind even the Chinese in developing that capacity. But they don't particularly, they're not particularly interested in Chinese hegemony any more than they were us. any more than they were the Brits eventually. What role does India play? The point is that it's a new world, and we're in the moment as we sit here. We're wandering around this matrix, literally, trying to figure out sort of what works. But that's, by definition, a different world. There are different risks, different potential for mistakes. Because the point of all this is going to be oops, and oops has an enormous cost. It has enormous cost in surgery. My surgeon once said oops, but it has enormous cost in power politics. Trade. Part of the reason the last 70 years were so terrific is we grew it. Chinese are listening. We grew a global trading system, and then it became hyper-global in the last decade or so. Is it survivable in that form? Put technology aside for a second. My short answer is, and this isn't Donald Trump. Donald Tusk is the EU. He's a former Polish president and is one of the 3 EU presidents. He blames us. I think that's wrong. I think the blame really sits with the way we let the system evolve over the last 15 years. All of my business friends were so interested in selling anything they possibly could to 1 billion Chinese that the Chinese cut a spectacular deal to get into the WTO and then more or less ignored a lot of those rules. I would have done the same thing if I were the Chinese. Why not? Including letting them accumulate $4 trillion in foreign exchange reserves by systematically manipulating the exchange rate. So if you have a country that's emerging towards global power status, do you really want them to have a $4 trillion kitty to work with? It's now down to 3, but it's $3 trillion is still a lot of money. That would be wonderful. And do you really want to let them systematically import technology from the West? The answer should probably be you'd be a little bit careful about this, but we weren't. And the issues that Trump has raised were the same issues Obama raised, were the same issues George W. Bush raised, were the same issues Clinton raised in terms of Chinese engagement in the trading system. The difference is because Donald Trump knows nothing about politics, he didn't understand it was inappropriate to actually call them on it. What's appropriate is you let the bureaucrats negotiate, nothing ever happens. So Trump calls them on it, and we have the trade war. Fast forward real quickly, by the way, this trade war with the Chinese, which is on pause at the moment, almost certainly ends with a deal in the next month. It's moving in all the right directions. The Chinese are actually making some incredibly significant concessions. They're not making them because they're nice guys. They may or may not be. They're making them because in this negotiation, which is horribly reported in the press, we are in a much better negotiating position than they are. We import Make America Great hats. They import food, technology, things that are critical both in their short run and to their medium run. They have an economy that is falling fast. They report growth rates no one should believe. Ask yourself why the price of oil did what it did last year. Ask yourself why Apple didn't sell any phones in China in the second half of last year. That economy is moving south so fast that they're worried about it, which if you're negotiating with them is great. We've got the leverage. We'll cut this deal. It'll be a decent deal. It'll last a year, 2 years or something. But it won't matter. It won't matter because the Chinese are not going to liberalize their economy in the way that it would make them vulnerable to yet more pressure. They will come away from this experience saying, we messed up. We left the Americans too much leverage to push us, and they will move in different directions. And the last point, everyone's focused on how coarse they should be, how rude they should be, how dumb they should be. Donald Trump is. They don't notice that every country in the world is in fact resorting to trade destroying measures. WTO is not working. There's a systematic increase across the board in people resorting to trade protectionism. It's not just us. It's because the system is not particularly working. And I'm going to get to the technology point in a second. But first, climate. First time I went to northern Greenland to hang out with some scientists, I got home and my older sister, I called my older sister who's sort of a very right-wing Republican, and it says, just in Greenland, and we're looking at glaciers, and we're looking at ice cores, and we're looking at this stuff. And she interrupts me and says, do you believe in climate change? And the answer was this. It's not I believe or don't believe in life after death. You have no choice. One map. So this is a heat map, heat and humidity map actually, from 2030. Business as usual scenario, which is to say that countries that are behaving the way they're behaving today continue behaving that way. So none of this green dream kind of thing. This is 2030. All of this heat is already baked into the world. It just has to gradually change the climate. 2030, that's tomorrow. These are the heat map is actually the number of days. The redder it is, the closer you get to the full year, the yellow down to the white, to nothing. These are the number of days a year at which those places are maybe uninhabitable. Uninhabitable. Heat over 35 centigrade and enough humidity that the body cannot function. So look at South America. Look at the Yucatan. Look at a whole chunk of the Indian coast. Look at those pieces in Southeast Asia. So remember that thing we were all reading about a moment ago. Oh, the 21st century is the Asian century. It's going to be too hot. They literally are not, I'd go over there by the fall if I got there. That's 2030. By 2050, that yellow is beginning to turn to red. In central India, by 2070, on their own forecast, something like 200 million people have to move. Because you literally will not be able to go outside absent those funny suits that they wear on places like the moon. Ditto the central Chinese plain. Again, several hundred million people will not be able to live there. And that isn't whether they want to or not want to. The question is, it'll just be too damn hot. And it's heat and humidity together that breaks down the human body. Heat alone, that's why the deserts aren't here. The deserts are the deserts. They are what they are. They're not changing. What's changing is all of these other places. That's a problem. And it's a problem not someday, it's a problem almost now. Never mind what we're seeing. So water. One of the things it does is water. All of the stuff you've been hearing for years about how hot it's getting, every year turns out to be the hottest on record other than the one before it, etc. Those measures are all measures of land temperature. You all know this intuitively. When you heat up water, it heats up much more slowly, but it retains that heat much longer. So it's the exact same physics affecting the planet that's getting hotter, and we see it. The land's getting hotter. The water's getting incredibly hotter. It's building up this heat. And what that does is it, combined with some other facts, begins expanding. That's just basic physics. So what does that do? If you live in southern Miami, you now live with nuisance flooding. What nuisance flooding means is some serious portion of the year you walk out your front door and your ankles are wet. And that's just because it floods. And it floods in about half the time now. And it's nuisance flooding because you're not driven from your house. It's not sandy in New York. You just get used to it. Mexico is either blessed or smart. Your big cities are not on the coast. The rest of us have our big cities on the coast. So what happens to New York, to Rio, to all of those Japanese cities that are on the coast? They either have, assuming something like this happens, they either have to leave, which is a little bit difficult, or they have to build some kind of protection. So after the Hurricane Sandy in New York, which, as you remember, swept up into the island, so everything south of whatever it was, 29th Street, there's these wonderful maps of Manhattan where they're dark. Everything south of 29th Street, all the way down to the tip, is dark because the power's gone. It flooded. The only building, by the way, with a light left on it was the Goldman Sachs headquarters. Now, the conspiracy theorists in New York, of course, said, look at that. The capitalists, they always win. Turns out, when they redid their building, they were smart enough to put the stuff on the roof instead of in the basement. The infrastructure. So it's a known. New York can flood. Mayor Bloomberg, after that, commissioned a very extensive, he brought in the Dutch, they know how to handle these things, very, very extensive study. What can you do about it? Well, the answer is you can build these enormous seawalls way the hell out, so you break up the waves before they come in. You turn the New Jersey shore into not a populated space, but rather a buffer space, etc. To this day, and I didn't remember when Sandy was, it's been a while now, not $1 has been spent on any of that infrastructure. We just approved a couple months ago the first potential spending, the first couple $100 million of something that is probably a multi-billion-dollar program. So politics moves at a political pace, but nature moves at a nature pace. This is going to happen again, and it's going to happen again soon. Now, the other point about water is this. The combination of rising seas, which causes some set of problems, and heat melts glaciers. This is obvious. We've all seen the polar bears there and having nowhere to go. There was a study published recently looking at the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush. And that's all ice up there. And that ice, the Indus Valley and other valleys, that ice melts at its own pace over the centuries. And that provides water for 2 billion people. Current estimate is that 1/3 of those glaciers are gone if there is no increase in global warming from today. And if there is, even if it doesn't go to that sort of business as usual, really stupid scenario, 2/3 of those glaciers are gone. Now, the real problem with that is, as glaciers melt, you get excessive water coming down those valleys and down those rivers, and you get floods. And then so you have too much water. And then eventually you don't have any water. And again, this is India. This is that entire part that's watered by the glaciers in the Himalayas. That's a problem. So technology. All technology is neutral. Technology can be used for good purposes or bad purposes, and technologists don't care. They want to make stuff. They want to invent stuff. They want to think about stuff. So I don't know if you follow gene editing. There was a case a couple months ago now, where a Chinese scientist published a paper telling the world that he had in fact altered the genes of twins that had been born. First documented case of a baby, 2 babies, born with edited genes. And he said, the reason I did this was that I wanted to control for the HIV, the gene that causes HIV/AIDS. He wasn't supposed to talk about it. He's not been seen recently. The Chinese have a way of dealing with these things. But he used technology that is being used, it was invented in the West. It's been exported globally. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of trials on humans in China, documented. We have just approved the first 3 trials. Mostly this is aimed at older people with fatal diseases that have no other possibility. So if you can manipulate the genes, you can maybe do something about it. There was a paper published last week that went back and looked at... Yes, ma'am. You cannot hear me? No one's ever said that. So, I'll get closer. Me and my water will get closer. 2 weeks ago, Science published a paper that said, you know, we looked at the work they published, and we know what they said they were doing, but it turns out the gene they edited actually controls memory. So the question they asked is maybe what they were trying to do in their experiment was create better brains, smarter people, better memories. Chinese have denied it, of course. A lot of my science friends say, boy, would we like to do that. But think about the ethical issue involved in letting scientists do what scientists want to do. When you think about artificial intelligence, you usually think about this. Is it going to destroy jobs? Answer, yes, it's going to destroy jobs. This is the United States. Brookings just came out with this recently. And this looked at most jobs in the United States and ranked them right to left, top to bottom, in the vulnerability to being automated. 61% of the American job force is either highly or whatever the medium likelihood of being replaced by artificial intelligence. Think about law firms. Go into a law firm in New York and ask them how many legal researchers they employ per lawyer. and ask them how many they employed 20 years ago. And you will find out that they employ almost none. Why? Because that's much better done. That stuff's easy by LexisNexis and its successor. Go into, in fact, the aforementioned Goldman Sachs. Ask them how they are doing more and more of their company research. Again, they're doing it with logarithms. Even the writing, in some cases, is being done by logarithms. Those aren't the jobs we know are gone. Go into a McDonald's. There's now there are a number of McDonald's, actually, that are fully automated. One person runs the McDonald's. A friend of mine is a very wealthy man who owns much of South America's McDonald's. And he said to me a couple years ago, I have the technology to eliminate most of my workforce. I, however, am a private investor, and I think that's immoral. So I'm not going to do it. But I know someday I'm going to sell this thing, and somebody else is going to buy it, and are they going to be willing to make less profit because of the morality of whether or not you employ people? And this is the United States. I have a meeting coming up in Cairo for a foundation I run, and I wanted to organize the meeting around the impact of technology. And the Egyptians said, why? Technology is not our problem. There's two things wrong with that answer. Every business guy I know is being educated either in the U.S. or Europe in business schools. They're being taught the exact same set of management tools, whether or not they're going to work in Mexico or work in California or work in Germany or India. And those tools are not labor intensive. Second point, capital is free. It's zero. It's been zero for a long time. So robots, by definition, are going to be cheaper. There's some work, which I'm not going to show you, that looked at the making of furniture in the U.S. versus Kenya, robots versus non-robots. The point at which the profitability of making furniture by humans in Kenya is only 5 years later than it is in the United States. It's going to be ubiquitous. This is changing the nature of work. We all grew up in a world where what you do defines who you are. Of course you work all day. That's what you do. And then eventually you retire or die. We, given the existing technology, do not need the number of people that exist today. Do not need them in a moment. Now, to come back to that as, oh, Alan, that's always true when technology changes and eventually it catches up. We'll need programmers. Go talk to the programmers. They're not programming with people. At the margin, their logarithms are writing their own logarithms. This is a sea change in how our economies work. Question, can you put it back into Pandora's box? There will be efforts to do that. I don't think they'll succeed. But that's trivial stuff. So I've got a friend who's a neuroscientist, a Spaniard at Columbia at the moment, one of the leaders of the Global Brain Initiative. And he said to me the other day, look, in my lab, I can today physically manipulate the brain of a mouse and change its behavior. The mouse, rat, whatever, behaves differently after I zap him in that particular place. And he said, I know if I can do it in a rat, I can do it in a human. Known. It's just a question of finally getting it to that next sort of step. He may be right, he may be wrong. He's terrified. And what he's terrified about, we all worry about our privacy. Who's seeing our tweets? Who's sharing our data? That's the old problem. Solvable, we don't care to solve it. The real problem is your identity. Because what they're working on and making tremendous progress with is brain-to-brain communication, none of this stuff in between, and brain-to-computer interface, BCI. Brain-to-computer interface essentially is you can think and the computer will translate your thoughts into words, action, whatever you want. So you no longer need this silly thing which we're going to get rid of our phones because you're just going to think and it'll happen. Brain-to-brain interface, if you're running a team, sounds great. You know, you sit around the table and you talk about teamwork. Well, imagine if you're sitting around and you're thinking literally collectively. That sounds wonderful. But think about the vulnerability. If you can do that, somebody else can share your thoughts with them. Either through the computer because it goes in both directions, or the brain because it goes in both directions. This isn't science fiction. These are published, these happen to be published, and a bunch of others, published work, known, just a matter of how fast does it happen. If that doesn't terrify you, I'm not sure what does, but DARPA up there, I don't know how many here know what DARPA is. Go Google DARPA. It's the coolest thing on the planet. It is the U.S. military's, it's one of their science research facilities. And DARPA is, and they have really cool videos on their website. They've got these robots that can dance. Their problem, of course, is if you're in the war business, what don't you want? You don't want humans on the battlefield. So they're working hard to get humans off the battlefield. That means you need robots that can, in fact, do everything a human can do on a robot. You push that a little bit further, and you say, well, who thinks faster, me or a computer? My mom thought I was real smart, but the computer thinks faster than I do. So the big issue in warfare these days is how many people do you keep in the chain? So as you think about the future of warfare, she who hits first lives. So there's a profound incentive in the technology to get humans out of the decision-making chain. That's a problem. And everybody stood up and said, I'll never do it. The U.S. has said, I'll never do it. The Russians have said, I'll never do it. They're all working on it. And they're working on it because that's the way to win that next war. Mass migration. These red lines are the major migration routes for migrants around the world. You see the Venezuelan diaspora, unfortunately. You see Central America moving up through Mexico. This is what exists today. There's two important points here. One is sort of look at Africa. Most of African migration is internal. It moves around inside Africa. A little bit spills off, goes across the Med, and causes uncharted hell in European politics. But most of it's wandering around the most unstable part of the global planet. You can count however many wars there are going on at the moment, part of the reason why these people are moving, but then they cause wars in the next country. That's point one. Internal movement is terribly important. The second point is those arrows all point towards industrial countries. The United States, Australia. Nobody goes to Japan because they figured out how to keep an island. Europe. What I know for sure is it's not just Donald Trump and his stupid wall. It's not just the Australians and their penal colonies. It's not just the Europeans saying, well, we'll take care of you back in Africa. All of those countries are going to systematically try to prevent migration. Where are the migrants going to go? New places. Mexico becomes a destination country. Morocco becomes a destination country. South Africa becomes a destination country. Countries that used to think of themselves, and the list goes on, Turkey. Turkey is already a destination country. They used to be transit countries. People went through them to get somewhere else. But if you can shut off that somewhere else, are they going to go home? And I said this to a client of mine in Mexico a couple of years ago. He said I was crazy. He literally said to me, who would want to come to Mexico? And I asked him if he'd ever been in the Northern Triangle. I asked him if he'd ever been in some parts of Africa. I asked him if he'd ever been in Syria during a war. Mexico is Jerusalem in the sense of compared to where they're coming from. Now, will we have more migrants? Answer is, this is a known. Yes, we're going to have more migrants. The World Bank has, is that too much? That's better. The World Bank thinks there will be 150 million climate migrants by 2030. 90 of those, they're doing something. 90 of those are Africa, the rest in either Latin America or in Asia. If you go back to that map with all that yellow and red on it, those are all going to generate climate migrants. So you put together insecurity plus climate, they got to do something to that. Insecurity plus climate plus the economics. People don't leave countries because they're dirt poor. They leave countries when they get better. There's this myth out there, oh, if we could only get Africa to develop, there wouldn't be any migrants. It's exactly the opposite. You can't move if you don't have money. You can't move if you don't understand where the hell you're going. So the more you develop at the start, it eventually turns around. Think about Mexico. But at first, the more you develop Africa, the more migrants you're going to get. So what? And this is just my paean to George Orwell. Shakespeare got it first. The Brave New World, that is. Almost all the stuff I've been talking about are global issues. The problem is our capacity to manage globally goes down as fast as the issues become increasingly global. Nationalism and populism may or may not be evil, but they're natural consequences of what's going on. People look for solutions. They look to strength for solutions. They move away from liberal democracy because it's not solving their problem. Technology is changing everything, and it's changing everything at a pace we've never seen. The climate thing is beyond my imagination. Why anybody thinks the 1.5 and 2% stuff from 2 degrees stuff from Paris, we have 3 degrees baked in, and if you could get the head of the IMF and the head of the World Bank on sodium pentothal, they would tell you, yeah, their work is all based on 3% is already done. Can we stop it going from 4 or 5%? That makes those heat maps look difficult. Autarky. I was trained as an economist at Yale a long time ago, and like any good economist, I was trained that free enterprise is best, free trade is even better, and autarky, that is to say, walls around an economy, is the third best. Technology is going to change that, and all of these fears are going to change that. We're moving to a place where autarky might work for the United States, might work for Canada, could work for Russia if they could manage the place. Big places with lots of could work for China. Big places with lots of resources and technology can become successful autarkic states. Let me switch quickly to Mexico, and that's supposed to be a picture. That's supposed to be that picture. I want to just sort of bring this home to Mexico and the United States a little bit very quickly. They actually do have some things in common. What they have in common is an uncanny ability to talk to their base. They really communicate better to a particular set of people, larger here than the United States, proportionally, than any of their predecessors. Secondly, they both have an economic model that is about the past. I don't think the world works that way. I think most of you don't think it works that way. But in both cases, when Donald Trump sees a Mercedes-Benz in the United States, he sees a German car. If you tell him it's made in South Carolina, he still sees a German car. And that's because he grew up in a world where that was true. And it's not that he's stupid. It's not AMLO has 25 ideas. I don't think our president has that many. But they're very, very fixed ideas. And they have that in common. 3, they are both interested in doing things. They both do not care about how it was done in the past. They do not care about you go in and tell either of them you can't do it, and you'll either be thrown out or just ignored. Thrown out in the Trump case, ignored in the AMLO case. Now the question obviously is how's this going to go? Will we go back to normal? What you all think is normal? So if you are most people in the world, you sure as hell hope Trump is an anomaly, one and done in college basketball terms. I don't think that's right. I think he is rather a symptom of a profound change going on in the United States. First, we have consistently for at least a decade had people tell pollsters, overwhelmingly, 2/3 of the nation, we're not headed in the right direction. That was true. They elected Obama to go in a different direction. That was true. They elected Trump, sort of, to go in a different direction. They're not going back because they can't go back to the status quo ante. We have no center. Republicans have gone way to the right. Democrats have gone way to the left. There literally is no center left. So if you sit around and say, well, the center's going to come back, you can't get a name in the center. It is not there. It doesn't exist. The Republicans, I'm a registered Republican. Party's a disaster. There is no party. It's amazing. He's a political genius. He wasn't a Republican until a second ago. He's completely taken over the party and has remade it in his own not very attractive image. And the Democrats are leapfrogging to the left in a place that is so not America that I can't even imagine how that's going to work at the polls. We may be at the end of the two-party system. That might be good. But it for sure is the last point. This is not a formula for worrying about the world. It's a formula for worrying about us. And you can't find anybody except the old State Department guys and people like me that think we should worry about the world. Can't. You got to worry about what's going on at home. I apologize for this, but I thought it was fun. And everybody I know could do this differently. The question again, are you a global citizen or an American firster? Do you believe in our missionary to make the world safe for democracy? Woodrow Wilson goes to war over it. Or in realpolitik, which of course is Dr. Kissinger. And everybody spreads wherever they are there. The question's not the past, that's the fun part of it. The question's the future. As I look at all of the 20 going on 30 Democratic candidates, they are all in that sort of space. Almost, they would not admit that the socialists in the Democratic Party have more in common with Trump than a lot of my Republican friends, but they do, because they're not focused on the world. They want to come home. They want to change the United States. I'm almost sure whomever is elected next, whether Trump is reelected, which is possible, or a Democrat beats him, they're not going to suddenly say, Bill Clinton had it right. They're going to say something quite different. I'm not rude enough to tell you what I think about AMLO, but this is obviously the same question here. This is a new model. Everything's being done differently. How will it end up? We can talk about if you want. What does this mean for the bilateral relationship? Which I think is relevant. In our case, we need this really deep and profound rethinking of how the place works. We're going to do it one way or the other. We're going to do it stupidly first, for sure, we always do, but we need that. We don't think, no one thinks, we can sustain the commitments we've made for the last 70 years globally. We're not going to do it. That's just black and white. It's not going to happen. There's nobody out there who Joe Biden might do it. He's not going to be the next president of the United States. In Mexico, I think you need a viable model. It's ridiculous this country in a good year grows 2% and in a bad year grows 2%. It's crazy. I don't see, and that's where AMLO comes from. I don't think his model is going to work, but if I were Mexican, I'd be working on what is that new model. And then finally, Mexico needs to define how it really wants to engage with the world. You've had foreign policies that said all that matters is the United States. You've had foreign policies that have said all that matters is anything but the United States. You've had foreign policies that are not foreign policies. And the reason they keep on jumping around, I think, is you don't know what you want from the world. Yes, geography matters. You've got to get the U.S. relationship right or you don't have anything. But the question is, what do you want from the world? I usually end these things, because everybody's depressed as hell by the time I get here. I used to use a Hieronymus Bosch painting of the end of the world, and someone came up to me, a client actually said, please never use that again, because my guys are all depressed. So how about a miracle? Maybe that's, now I'm going to stop talking, you get to talk now. Maybe we should talk about miracles. I used this recently and someone said, well, what miracles do you have in mind? The answer is, what miracles do you have in mind? Thank you very much. So it's not my house. I'm not sure how this is supposed to work, but I will ask for questions. Yes? Questions? Anything? Are there microphones? There's microphones.
Thanks, Alan. Very, very interesting. So, two things. One, on the U.S. side, basically the biggest impacts on the quality of life and prosperity of the middle classes have been three things: housing going up in the places where there are jobs, education, and healthcare. That's basically the black hole where income has gone for the middle class. And if you were to fix those three things, I think you'd do a lot to ameliorate those situations that you were pointing out. And I don't see anybody really tackling those issues. On a global basis, it's really getting beyond, in order to take to take to the logical end what you just said. It's basically rethinking what it means to be human, right? And the question is there even a group out there that is capable of taking on such a massive rethink?
I don't have to answer the first because there wasn't a question, so that's good. I semi-disagree with you. We can do that over drinks. But the second is an important point. So Dr. Kissinger, who's been a friend and a colleague for a long time, I've worked for him since the 80s on and off, he's 95 now. Henry has never in his life sent an email. But he's begun for about 5 years now to think about artificial intelligence. He wrote a fabulous article, which I'd recommend to everyone, in The Atlantic a couple months ago. It's worth reading. It's titled, I believe, something like The End of the Renaissance. And his concern is precisely a humanity concern. He's concerned, it's a known if you talk to the neuroscientists, that when you read a screen or you read a physical book, different parts of your brain light up. It's a known, we know that. We don't know the so what. Do you learn differently? Do you remember differently? Do you process differently? But we know for sure, and neuroscientists tell you this, the brain works differently as it reacts to a screen, as it reacts to physical paper. The tragedy of the internet, of course, is that it opens up the wisdom of the ages to everybody. The most democratic thing that's ever happened, because you can get any information you want, and you can get it any time of day you want, any place in the world except in New York, because the internet doesn't work, that you want. But what has internet done in practice? Internet spawns social media. Social media has brought the world, instead of open it up, it's brought it in. It's reduced us as humans. And that's, think about your kids. Think about, it drives my wife crazy. We go into restaurants in the United States, family sits down next to us, they all take out their devices, the mother, father, and the 3 kids, and so they don't talk to each other. I don't know who the hell they're talking to or interacting with. Where does humanity go? And you take it further, the brain-to-brain stuff and the brain-to-computer stuff is terrifically scary. A couple weeks ago, I was invited actually by Congressman Cuevas, who's now the president of the IPU, to Geneva to talk to a group of politicians from around the world. All of these were very senior-ranking congressmen or senators, and I gave a somewhat different, but more or less, I talked more about the science, because my point to them was, you guys aren't doing your job. You're not even thinking about these issues. And I finished, and I expected them to be madder than hell at me, because I just called them out. Guy raises his hand, a European, and he says, yep, you're right. We really should be thinking about this stuff. But I got to get reelected. I don't have time for it. We should maybe think about doing this next year, the year after, or someday. At the time when the Chinese, and then the Chinese, others are doing this, so I'm blaming the Chinese only because it's easy. That gene editing stuff, everybody on the planet should be terrified. And yep, you talk to the scientists, I talk to the scientists, they say, we're not going to do it. We promise we won't do it. They are going to govern themselves. Not going to happen. Not going to happen. There was an example, a case a couple years ago. Remember avian flu? Avian flu was going to be a huge pandemic. The only thing at the moment, because we didn't have the right antibodies for it, the only thing we, society, had going for us was that avian flu could not be transmitted through the air. It literally, I don't know, you had to kiss a chicken or something. I don't know what you had to do. But it could not be translated through the air. So there was a scientific conference. They get up, they read papers to each other. Guy gets up to read a paper, and he proves that he has figured out how to aerate avian flu. Everybody in the room is shocked. You did what? And he said, well, if we can aerate it, we can figure out what happens if it aerates. And so the society, this was one of the big global societies, they said, we're not going to publish your paper. He sued them on academic freedom issues. They published the paper. They tried to stop the formula how you could do this with your home chemistry set. They lost that too on academic freedom. So this paper's out there, and if you're a terrorist, you in fact can go. So you can. This is all headed in the wrong direction. One would think if we humans created it, we should be smart enough to manage it. But I go back to the global point. You can't manage it at a nation-state level. You cannot do it. Because there's always going to be some nation that says, I'm this tiny little country, but what if we're the tallest people in the world? We can win the NBA. So you need global governance. We're incapable of global governance. That's the dilemma that we find ourselves in. And that heads right towards find me strong leaders. It heads right towards the end of democracy. On that cheery note, there must be another question.
Do you consider AMLO's movement a fascist movement? And why yes or why not?
I'm sure it's not a fascist movement because you go back and study what the fascists actually were and how they conceptualized themselves, how the Italians, which were the real fascists, and the Spaniards, who were the real fascists. This is totally different. He's a populist, in my judgment. He's a populist who has, as I said a moment ago, I think an absolutely amazing ability as a politician to interact and talk to people, to understand the people. I don't think, and this is, it's in common with Trump. Trump has never made a claim to speak for the American people. He speaks for his base. AMLO, in my judgment, speaks for his base, is acting for his base. We used to hope that politicians actually worked for the national interest, but that's not how you win elections anymore. And that's for all sorts of reasons, technology being one of them, that's not how you'd be crazy to run the President of the United States and say, I'm going to govern for all the people. I want all the people to vote for me. You wouldn't get elected. Can't get there from here. So I don't think he's a fascist. I don't think he's anything like, you go back again and look at the elements of fascismo and what it was at the time. I do think he's a populist. Your next question is going to be, does he respect democratic institutions? Which is sort of what you think you meant by fascism. The answer is, you're 3 months into this. Who the hell knows? He certainly respected the ballot box, since this is a guy who should have given up a long time ago, was told to give up a long time ago, and kept on, not only kept on running, validated by democratic institutions, built his own party, won both houses. Authoritarian, perhaps. Fascist, no, they don't bother about both houses. They bother about the levers to power. Punto, end of discussion. This is something much more democratic. Now, did I vote for him? No, I couldn't. Would I have voted for him? Of course not. On the couch. She's got the most comfortable seat in the house.
Not really. I'm all crooked.
Oh, hi.
Hi. I wanted to see what you think about the 2020 election in the U.S., chances of Trump being reelected.
Unanswerable question today because I don't know who's going to be his opponent. I can give you, against certain opponents, he wins. Back up for the analysis just very quickly. One, not a single person who voted for him won't vote for him next time, in my judgment. He won with 2/3 of the white vote. He'll win with 2/3. He'll get 2/3 of the white vote next time. The question is, will that be enough? It wasn't enough last time to win the global poll. It was enough to win the Electoral College. Second point, the Democrats are frantically leaping to the left. It's stunning. Every day you wake up and there's a new proposal: free college for everybody. This is going to sound familiar. Free medical care for everybody. We're going to pay the Indians back for taking the country from them. Wealth tax, 70% marginal tax rates. I mean, it just keeps on going and going. The new Clean Deal proposal. The nation is not that far left. How do I know that? So Gallup just published a poll the other day. They really systematically looked at people who are either Democrats, which is only a third of registered voters, or leaning Democrat, so you get up to 50%. The liberal part of the party, or the Democratic voters, are all white liberals, and they tend to be better educated. They're a significant number of people, all my friends. But the black and the Hispanic parts of the Democratic Party are much more conservative. They're moderate to conservative. They don't like Donald Trump. I guarantee they don't like Donald Trump. They're not going to like, you talk to Hispanics in the United States who are upwardly mobile, who want to be in the middle class, and tell them you're going to have a 50% tax rate. And they're going to say, I'm not voting for that. So the danger the Democrats have is if they're stupid, they will, and the process works to make them stupid, actually. I can explain if you want. If they nominate someone who's far on the left, Donald Trump has a 60-40 chance of winning. If they nominate someone that's sort of center in the Democratic Party, they can win. The problem is the people who are center are people like Joe Biden, who's older than Moses, Mike Bloomberg, who is a Republican or Democrat or Republican or Independent or whatever, whose pollsters tell him there's no way he can win, however much money he wants to invest. You're hard-pressed to find, I said it earlier, there's no center. So in the Democrat, you're hard-pressed to find this sort of center-right piece. One comment on the process. Because we just had this election and all the new blood in the Democratic Party is young and liberal and noisy, they are demanding litmus tests. We won't support you if you don't support the new Green Deal. We won't support you if you don't support Medicare for all. We won't support you if you don't blah, blah, blah. And they're trying to get everybody to agree. Oops. So if you are a sort of on the center, Senator Harris from California is desperately trying not to answer questions because the party wants to drag her over there, and she's smart enough to know you're not going to elect that person. You could re-elect Trump if you do that. And then there's Howard Schultz. So he's tired of Starbucks. He wants to be president. He doesn't want to be a Democrat. Can you fix this? I can just scream. He doesn't want to. But who would anybody who voted for Trump vote for Schultz? No. Would he capture that center-right Democratic Party? Maybe. That guarantees that. That's why Bloomberg won't run as an independent candidate. He's smart enough to know that his legacy would be hideous if he gives Trump a second term. Long-winded answer. Can I tell you Trump is not the next president of the United States? No. If you're a betting woman, should you bet a lot against him? No. He's very good at what he does. I was saying to someone earlier, think about the wall. Think about how coarse, rude, objectionable he was during the campaign. Talking about a Mexican I've never met. I know Mexico pretty well. Go look the last time he used the word Mexico, Mexican. The language has changed. He talks about the wall, which is a symbol to his base. Has nothing to do with Mexico. Has absolutely nothing to do with Mexico. Has nothing to do with the border either. It's just, it's a political symbol. It's the airport. Of course AMLO was going to get rid of the airport. It represents everything, and he told you repeatedly, and it represents everything he hates. So he needs the wall. But he's cleaned up the language. Why has he cleaned up the language? He's not stupid. He knows he needs a few more votes. And he knows those Hispanic votes are potential, those conservative family values, despite his family values, votes could get him elected. This guy's very good at what he does. Now, he may die in office because he's obese. And because he's obese, I'll stop there. Yes, Mariana. NAFTA. The question is, she doesn't need the microphone. The question is the ratification of NAFTA. The ratification of NAFTA, or USMCA, which you cannot pronounce, has absolutely nothing to do with Mexico. It's entirely a domestic political issue. It has everything to do with the answer to Anna Paula's question, what the election's looking like as we get close to it. So, for example, in the negotiations, Mexico committed to a new labor law. That new labor law, of course, was supposed to have been passed a long time ago. It's not even been proposed yet. I think it's not been proposed yet because people are trying to figure out what the hell do the Americans want. What's the minimum the Americans want in this labor law thing, which probably doesn't make a lot of sense anyhow. The little problem is we don't care. It has nothing to do with whether we pass this or not. So if you're a Democrat, will you give Trump in the election season a victory? So as Nancy Pelosi, head of the Congress, head of the House of Representatives, sits here and thinks about the world, she doesn't care about the labor law. She may use it as an excuse. That's a different issue. I think it's no more than 50-50. I think it's probably less than 50-50. And in fact, it's appalling how little lobbying is going on. The business community is not engaged. I assume that the Mexican government's doing something. I haven't seen it anywhere. When we passed NAFTA originally, there was a really concerted, trilateral business, private sector, non-business government effort to pass it. None of that's going on. Obvious question is why. I'm not sure the answer. I've got some theories, but none of it's going on. Will it pass itself? Yeah, maybe, but maybe not. The question is, what if it doesn't? And one of the tests you're going to see very soon, I think you're going to have the next trade war after China is the auto trade war. I think this is guaranteed in the spring. For the reasons I mentioned earlier, the president doesn't like foreign cars. Mexico and Canada are technically going to be exempt from that because there's a side letter. There are people in this room that know better than I, but I think those side letters are wishful thinking, particularly if NAFTA itself is in political trouble. Now, does the president want to whack Mexican-made cars? Not particularly. He wants to whack German-made cars. But as you saw with steel and aluminum, it shouldn't surprise anyone if the exemptions are few and far between, if in fact we put in place 25% tariffs on imported autos. That'll be an absolutely fascinating political exercise. 25% tariff on autos raises the average price of a car in the United States by $5,000. Voters will notice that. And so the reason not to do the tariffs has nothing to do with autos, it has to do with the election. So he only does the tariffs if he thinks the Europeans will blink as fast as the Chinese blinked. So this is a calculus. He's got, the election's not till November of next year. So he's got a lot of time, and he believes in tariffs. He believes that he got USMCA because of tariffs on Mexico and Canada. He believes he will get China because of tariffs on the Chinese. He believes in tariffs. He thinks they work. You have a microphone.
Okay. What are the chances that he will be impeached?
I think they are almost zero. Donald Trump is a horrible human being. Donald Trump is, I can think of lots of adjectives. To get impeached, it's helpful if you violate the law.
But he's lying.
Lying is, you will go to hell for that. I'm not sure you go to jail for lying. It depends. Now, if you lie, for example, think about all of his advisors who are in jail. They lied to the FBI. He hasn't been interviewed by the FBI. He's not stupid. Why do you think that, in fact, his lawyers would not let him be interviewed by Mr. Mueller? They submitted written questions. The Mueller team, the Trump team submitted written answers because the Donald has a bit of a problem with the definition of truth. And you lie to a prosecutor, to the FBI, and that is illegal. That's a problem, and that's an impeachable offense. Now, you can say, well, look at Clinton. Clinton was impeached because he didn't control the House. Democrats control the House. If you're the Democrats and you want to win the presidency next year, and that is your only dream in life, do you impeach? You can't convict. The way our system works, the House impeaches and the Senate tries. The Republicans in the Senate are not, however much they hate the man, they're not going to convict him. So you make him a martyr hero. We're talking Joan of Arc, to his base. And even if his base was getting mad at him for all the obvious reasons, they're motivated. So Pelosi's problem is she's got a lot of people in her caucus who think he should be impeached. And it's high crimes and misdemeanors, and no one's ever really defined that. For Clinton, it was a pretty low crime and misdemeanor. I don't think she'll let a bill of impeachment come to the floor because it's political death in the elections. Now, if suddenly we find, based on the facts we know them today, if suddenly something else comes out, the one other thing to remember is he is right that at least half of constitutional scholars believe you cannot indict a sitting president for a crime. It's never happened in the history of the United States. That's why they invented impeachment. So these guys who are running around trying to prove that he did evil things and illegal things when he was a private citizen, with all due respect to those of you who are in the real estate business, it would not be stunning news that a New York real estate guy violated the law. this would not even get a front page headline other than he's the president. But that isn't impeachable. And it's not even clear it's indictable. It'll be a fascinating constitutional structure, but it can't get done before the election. Long-winded answer, but the short answer is no, he's not going to be impeached. He may be impeached by hamburgers, but that's a different way. I'm going to take one more question.
Hello, thank you, Alan. So my question is, in this context where technology is outpacing regulation and we're seeing a world where reaching consensus is increasingly difficult, where the political landscape is increasingly uncertain, how likely is it for, from your standpoint, that the world will agree on some sort of global framework to govern the flow of data and to address these technological risks that you mentioned at the outstart?
It is more likely that Donald Trump will be impeached than that we're going to do that.
Okay, thank you.
We don't even have global agreement on cleaning up landmines. The United States is not a member of the International Court of Justice, neither the Chinese or Russians. People who have power by definition don't want to be limited by these agreements. The interesting question, which is where I'll end because you're telling me to stop, I think we're headed in really bad ways on every dimension I can imagine. Something bad is going to happen, guaranteed. Will that bad be bad enough to actually shake us out of the idiocy that we're working with today? How bad does that bad have to be? The Chinese weren't wrong when they came to us in 2013 and said this isn't going to work. We are embedded. We are the legacy power. You all have. Look, if you had a choice between a pile of dollars and a pile of pesos, which you're going to take? You're going to take the dollars. Thank you, because as long as you do that, we can do whatever we want. It's Bunk's theory why. It's why the Europeans have failed. It's why the Chinese have a long time before they're a global power. And I don't know how you get us back. Remember that slide, global citizens and firsters? I don't know how you get us back headed towards global citizens. I know very, very, very few people. I don't know businessmen running their businesses in that direction. I don't know politicians. So how do we get back there and say there are global goods that we need to be promoting, or we're all going to sink? Last comment, I promise. So I've done some work recently on migration, and we were in Tangier in a conference that I'd organized, and there was a psychologist who was talking to us about how people figure out how to ignore crisis. And he said, think about how many people have died in the Mediterranean as their boats sink. Find me one bit of outrage, one country, 10 people that are outraged that, oh, another 100 just drowned. It's true in the United States, too. Certainly true in the United States. And so how do we, and his answer was you use psychological mechanisms to indeed block all that out. It's not about me, but it keeps on pulling you in closer. So the odds of becoming more global go down every time one of those damn boats sink, every time people die on the border. People should be outraged. We get one more dead baby case, my dinner table gets all excited, nobody does anything. And it happens here too. It's not just us, it's you too. Think about the camps in the South. And I'm not blaming you, I'm just saying that we're not, any of us, behaving like global citizens. Final comment. Remember what Theresa May said. If you are a global citizen, you're a citizen of nowhere. And most people I know would say, oh my God, that's awful. But we all behave exactly that way. I do too. So I don't know how you, long-winded answer again, I don't know how you break out of that. But I know if we don't, this future, which is pretty dystopic, it's pretty Orwellian. We're in that path. How do we break it? That's the challenge. We're not going to solve it tonight. Thank you very much. Back to you.